A lot of people think the fear around artificial intelligence is mostly about jobs. I think that is only part of it. The deeper disturbance is what happens when something you spent years building into part of your identity suddenly becomes easier to simulate, affecting not just your income or your role, but your sense of being useful, your sense of being the one who knows, and your sense of being distinct. That is a different kind of disruption. For a lot of people, expertise is not just something they sell. It is something they became and part of how they understand themselves. The writer, the analyst, the designer, the engineer, the strategist, the person everybody calls when something complicated needs to be figured out, the one who can explain the mess, fix the problem, or produce the thing at a high level when it really matters. That is why this shift feels deeper than a normal automation story. If work were only about money, then the whole conversation would stay at the level of wages, tasks, and labor markets. Those things matter, of course, but they are not the whole story. A lot of people do not just work for a paycheck. They build dignity, confidence, status, trust, and self-respect around what they know how to do well. Their competence becomes part of their identity. And when artificial intelligence starts handling pieces of what made someone feel competent, useful, or rare, the disruption is not only economic, it becomes personal. What makes this so strange is that real expertise does not disappear overnight. The years still happened. The experience still matters. The judgment is still real. But some of the visible signals that used to represent that expertise get cheaper very quickly. A polished explanation, a strong summary, a clean first draft, a smart-looking recommendation, or a competent comparison, all the things that used to feel like visible proof of depth suddenly become easier to produce. That changes something important. The value may still be real, but the signal gets noisier. A person can still be deeply capable while feeling less visibly distinct, and that can be surprisingly disorienting. Not because they became less intelligent, and not because their effort meant nothing, but because the old evidence of their expertise no longer lands the same way. That is where a lot of the unease comes from. The unsettling question is not only whether this will change your job. The deeper question is what exactly you are if something can imitate part of what you do. That question hits hard, especially for people whose self-respect is strongly tied to competence. If part of your identity was built around being the one who could do something difficult well, then watching a tool simulate part of that ability can feel like more than competition. It can feel like flattening, as if something personal is being reduced to output. When that happens, people usually fall into one of three bad responses. The first is clinging to the old markers of value. They double down on output, speed, polish, or productivity, as if producing more visible work will restore the distinction they feel slipping away. But that is a losing game because the tools are already pushing those signals toward abundance. The second bad response is collapse. The person starts to feel that if a tool can imitate part of their work, then maybe the years were not worth as much as they thought. Maybe none of it was special. Maybe the whole thing was more replaceable than they wanted to believe. That reaction is understandable, but it is wrong. Simulation of competence is not the same thing as lived competence. The third bad response is trying to solve an identity problem like it is a branding problem. more positioning, better packaging, and a sharper personal story can help at the edges, but they do not answer the deeper question. If your sense of worth is built too heavily on being the visible producer of output, then no amount of presentation will fully stabilize you once the output gets easier to imitate. What remains rare is not as small as people think. Judgment, taste, discernment, context sensitivity, responsibility, and the ability to stay steady when the situation is unclear are all still rare, and so is the ability to know what matters, what does not, and why. Most important of all, though, is trustworthiness, not the ability to sound convincing, but the kind of judgment people trust when something real is at stake. That is the deeper shift I think many people are being pushed toward, whether they want it or not. Maybe the goal is not to be the only person who can produce the thing anymore. Maybe the goal is to become the kind of person who understands what the thing should be for, whether it is any good, what it is missing, what trade-offs it carries, and what happens if it is wrong. Maybe the deeper form of expertise was never just production in the first place. Maybe production was only the visible surface of something more important underneath. That does not make the transition easy. It is still uncomfortable to realize that some of the old ways you measured your own value are getting weaker. It is still unsettling when the signals that used to reassure you no longer work the same way, but that discomfort may be pointing towards something real. It may be pushing people to rebuild identity around deeper qualities than output alone, around steadiness instead of speed, around discernment instead of display, around responsibility instead of polish, and around being the person others can trust when the stakes are high and the answers are not obvious. That is a more durable kind of identity, and maybe, in the long run, a healthier one too. If your entire sense of self depends on being the only person who can produce a certain kind of output, then your identity becomes fragile the moment the tools improve. But if your identity is built around judgment, taste, trust, and the ability to carry responsibility in complex situations, then you are building around something deeper than the surface. So here's a useful question to sit with this week. What part of your work is just visible output, and what part of it is really judgment, taste, context, trust, and responsibility? Then ask yourself one more question. Which of those parts do you actually want to build your identity around over the next few years? Because if artificial intelligence can imitate part of what you do, that does not mean your years meant nothing. It may just mean the visible surface of expertise is changing, and you are being pushed to build around something deeper than the output alone. That is uncomfortable, but it may also be the beginning of a more durable kind of value. What part of your expertise feels most tied to your identity?